Okay, so my name is Dr. Claire Hardaker, and I'm going to talk to you today about trolling. Particularly, I'm going to take a corpus approach to this phenomenon, which is known as a computer-mediated communication phenomenon. So, to start with, we need to understand what CMC, or computer-mediated communication, is. And if we take some basic key factors, essentially it's human communication that goes between two human beings via some kind of device. So that could be a mobile phone, it could be a computer, it could be a Kindle, an iPad, etc. There are some key factors about CMC that are really important that affect the way that we communicate. So the first one that we should consider is the notion of anonymity. This sense that we are invisible, it's very difficult to find us, and because of this we can get this sense of invulnerability, so that if we do something horrible online that people aren't going to be able to find out where we are or who we are. Another issue is that when we're using the internet, when we're using online communication, it can have this really distancing effect. It can make us feel psychologically like the other person isn't really a human, so it has a dehumanizing effect on the recipient that we are speaking to. A third issue is that it can bring about disfluency, and one of the reasons for this is because we can have this assumption that the way that we interact face to face will work in just the same way as it works online. So for instance, if somebody doesn't respond to you very quickly by email, you might immediately assume that they're ignoring you. In fact, they might be having a technical problem, their computer might be broken, something like this, but it can lead to these assumptions that, well, they haven't responded because they're angry with me. So we have factors to do with CMC that can make it more prone to aggression, to manipulation than, say, for instance, just normal face-to-face communication. So I'm going to talk about three basic research questions today, and then I'm going to very briefly mention a fourth, but I don't really talk about it very much. Those questions are, first of all, what is this behaviour known as trolling? And this is something I tackled in some 2010 research, and I'll sort of tell you how I tackled that. The next one I'm going to talk about is how is trolling carried out, so how is this behaviour effectively enacted online. And the third one I'm going to talk about very briefly is how do users respond. This is some work that I'm currently working my way through right now. And one that is planned, so this is a forthcoming piece, is essentially what motivates trolling. Why do people go about this behaviour? What seems to trigger it? So all of these questions take a quantitative approach and then move into qualitative analyses. So effectively corpus linguistics to get the results, and then we move from there into analysing it in a qualitative way. So, question one, what is trolling? How is trolling defined? When I began this research back in the day, sort of about 2007 and so, what I found was that when I looked through academic research, there were very, very few of any kind of research on this piece of, this area. So essentially, if we look through, for instance, Donath, 1998, she defines trolling as intentionally giving poor advice. So someone will ask you for a way of dealing with something, and you will get some really poor answer back that is dangerous, potentially offline, inflicting danger. If you look at Dahlberg, 2001, she suggests that it's covert disruption of a group. So you go onto the group and you sneakily try to get people arguing. If we look at Herring et al. 2002, she says that it's frustrating circular discussion. So it's not necessarily aggressive in its own right, but it just leads people in circles and it's very annoying. The issue that we have with all of these is they're contradictory for a start, and another problem is that they are drawn from things like intuition. Literally, what do these people think trolling is? They've taken it from ephemera, they've taken it from the media. They haven't taken these definitions from large data sets, if you like. So finding that there wasn't really any good research from that angle, the next thing I did was I moved on to reference works, dictionaries, encyclopedias, that kind of thing. The problem with those is those definitions tend to be very short, they tend to be very vague, and they're rather decontextualised, and they contradict each other as well. The next place I had a look at was UK and US legislation. So I looked through lots of different laws to try and find something that related to this, and found that there were very little in the way of any kind of guidance for online misbehaviour at all. And the last place that I looked was basically online in the media. And what we found was actually a surprising amount of agreement. There was a lot of disagreement, but surprisingly more agreement than I was finding in the other sources. So my problem was then, if you're going to sort of take a definition and research this topic, where do I take it from? Because all of these sources were contradictory, some of them provided no definition whatsoever. So you need a source and you need to have a good robust definition to work from. So my solution was, we'll let the users define the word. Instead of me trying to define it or to cherry pick a particular definition I like, let the users come up with a definition. So my way of approaching this was I created two corpora, RE, rec equestrian, and SF, soc football. A little bit of information about those corpora. So rec equestrian is mainly middle-aged, middle-class American women. Soc football is mainly young, working-class British males, so quite different groups. And then basically I used corpus methods to retrieve every instance of the word troll, so trolling, trolled, etc. That did give me a lot of false hits as well, so I got a few troll-ups and a few trollids in there, but I managed to get those out, and that kind of gave me around about 3,700 hits to work with. So on the slide coming up, you'll see a bit of a table of the actual corpora, when they were created, when the corpora were collected, how many subscribers they had in each group at the particular time. One thing I would say is when you look at this table, the corpus word count is something to be very cautious of, because whilst the RE corpus is about 63 million words, what you have to bear in mind is this is Usenet data, and one of the effects of Usenet data is it's like email, so you constantly get re-quoting of previously posted material. So the word counts are likely extremely inflated, but it's very difficult to figure out what the real word count would be. Okay, so having retrieved these 3,700 and so examples, the next thing to do is to then work through them and perform a kind of analysis. And the initial results showed very quickly that we have sort of three major elements going on. The first one is that trolling is nearly always manipulative. There is this attempt to get someone to be angry, to go out and do something foolish, for instance. So there's a lot of trying to control someone in a certain way. The next element is that it's very frequently deceptive as a type of behaviour. And that can occur at a number of levels. It can be a deception of identity, it can be a deception of conveying a apparently sincere attitude that's not actually real, it can be literally lying about a certain scenario. The one thing that was quite weird was that the aggression dimension is something that the media mentions a great deal. If we look through media reports, it's always about how aggressive trolling is. But in the Usenet data, what we actually found was that they are very rarely aggressive. It does happen, you do get cases of trolls who say really offensive things, but it's nowhere near as common as the manipulation or the deception element. So from these 3,700 examples, it was possible to build a much more useful definition than the ones that I'd seen sort of in academia, in reference works and so forth. So the definition that I came up with, and I'll just read it to you, was trolling is the deliberate perceived use of impoliteness or aggression, deception and or manipulation in CMC to create a context conducive to triggering or antagonizing conflict, typically for amusement's sake. This is quite a broad definition still, but one of the decisions that I made was that I didn't want to break down into specific subtypes, for instance, griefer, etc., because that actually introduces more confusion than it solves. There's also an issue with this in that anytime you come up with a definition, you find that the behaviour can change very quickly, and the definition that you came up to match it no longer sort of works. So one of the issues recently, for instance, is in the media we've seen the case of Caroline Criado Perez, for instance, who campaigned to have a woman put on a British banknote and received all kinds of rape, death threats and so forth, and a number of other prominent females around her also received bomb threats, and the media was very quick to call this trolling. Now that kind of falls outside of what I would define as trolling, but we have to bear in mind that since no one person owns the word, any definition you come up with will only work as long as that definition stays the same, and they're always changing. So the second question that I tackled was, how is trolling carried out? Basically, what are the strategies that people use when they decide to carry out this kind of behaviour? So I worked through these 3,700 examples to try and find and categorise the strategies, but we have some caveats that we have to be careful of right from the beginning. So the great majority, 99% of the examples, involve people talking about trolling as a behaviour. So saying to each other, do you think this person is trolling, or you are trolling me, this kind of thing. We've got people discussing it between themselves. And we also have people denying accusations. I'm not doing this, you know, you're trolling me. We have very few that involve what you would call admissions of trolling, where people actually say, yes, that's what I'm doing. In fact, in the entire set of examples I looked at, I had 4 admissions effectively. And the issues that you have to bear in mind when you look at those is they could very well be lying. They may actually not have been trolling, but it may have been a method of saving face. Other issues are that when you look at the examples, not everyone identifies why they've accused someone of trolling. So they may say, you know, ignore A, they're trolling the group, but then they don't say why they think that person is doing this. So it's really important to be careful when you're trying to pull strategies out. Why does it seem like that person is making that accusation? And if it's not clear, then it's very difficult to work with that data. Another issue, sort of as I've mentioned, is that not all the accusations or confessions are going to be honest. You have instances of individuals saying, well, yes, I accused him or her of trolling, I did it to get them removed from the group. And so they're effectively saying, I didn't really believe this accusation, I just made it as a means to an end. So effectively, I found 6 major strategies in the 2 corpora that I looked at. And sort of going from roughly, if you like, most covert through to most overt, and effectively also through from strategies that you would argue are annoying but not criminal through to ones that you could say, you know, that's a reasonably criminal thing to do. We'll start with sort of the least offensive, if you like. So digression, particularly onto sensitive topics, was a really common strategy. So for instance, you would get someone who would join a Darwin board and say to all the members, you should find Jesus, you guys are all going to hell. And then that same user might then go onto a Christianity board and say, you guys should read Darwin, you're all idiots. So this digression, particularly onto sensitive topics, just to annoy people. Another strategy was criticism, and particularly hypocriticism. So criticising others for something that that person was themselves guilty of. So one of the classic examples that we see is that you'll have a user who will respond very sincerely, they'll put a lot of effort in, they will, you know, write a very long response, they will reference and cite sources, and someone will respond simply with, you know, you apostrophised incorrectly. And in that response, there'll be a typo or some kind of error. And what was really interesting about that strategy for me was that one seems to be particularly successful at triggering responses from other users. It's like they can't resist then jumping back on that person and, you know, attacking them. Third strategy, sort of in the middle now between, you know, sort of covert and overt, is this antipathy strategy. So antagonizing the group, for instance, joining a cat group, which is for people who are all about cats, and then sort of complaining about cat hairs and cat behavior and meowing and scratching of furniture, and essentially acting as though cats are the worst thing on earth. So basically setting yourself against whatever that group or that person is all about. A fourth strategy, and this is where we can start to debate whether or not we're moving into some kind of illegal behaviour, is this endangerment strategy that we saw before was raised by one of the other researchers. So giving bad advice, setting a bad example, for instance. So you might have someone saying on a horse group, you know, I have a very young horse and I'd like to put my daughter on it, but the horse is quite dangerous. And one of the examples that's in my data, for instance, is that someone says, put your daughter on the horse and beat the horse until it submits, because then you are effectively teaching the horse that it should behave whilst it's got your child on board. Anyone who knows anything about horses knows that's extremely dangerous. Actually, that would be very likely to cause a great deal of harm, possibly kill the daughter. So this endangerment, but presenting it as though it's very serious, sincere advice. The next one is the one that the media is very fond of, and this is the shock strategy. So being deliberately cruelly insensitive. The classic scenario for this is that you have a child who passes away in very tragic circumstances. You have someone who sets up a Facebook tribute board, for instance, and then you'll have people who will go onto that board and they will post really offensive things about the child or about the family. And so you'll get things like, your child deserved to die, and jokes based on the way that that person has passed away. And the next one, which again the media are very fond of, is this aggress strategy. So literally attacking someone, threatening them, sending some kind of message to them that intimidates them in real life. So in this next slide, you'll see an image that's been sent to Stella Creasy MP, and this was part of the Caroline Criado Perez case. So as you can see in the image, basically they say, I'm going to be the first thing you see when you wake up. And the image that they've posted to go with that tweet appears to be a still from a film, from a Halloween film. It's an image of a person holding what looks like a kitchen carving knife, and they appear to have some kind of mask on their face. So effectively what we have here is this implied message that I'm going to find you and kill you, or stab you, something like that. So the third question that I then tackled was, how do users respond? Now this isn't how should you respond very much, this is just how do people respond, and when they respond in that way, what kinds of results do they tend to get from that? So again, I kind of found approximately 6. Chances are if we looked at different data we would find different amounts or different strategies. But one of the most common strategies that I found, or not really a strategy really, one of the most common responses I found was sincere engagement, where people don't recognise that they are being trolled, that they are being wound up, and they respond very sincerely, and that's considered a success for the troll. The next one, and this is the one that tends to be typically prescribed as a way of dealing with trolls, was to ignore, or to try and tell people ignore, do not respond. Now the interesting thing about this was it tended to be very slow. Trolls didn't always respond to it very well. They would, hang around in the group for weeks. And the other thing was it's not always effective, because let's imagine that you're on a horse group and you've got someone giving bad advice. If you don't respond to that bad advice, you may have someone who comes along, very sincerely follows it, and harm is caused in the real world. So you can ignore trolling and it's a personal convenience, but are you then morally doing the wrong thing? The next strategy that I found a great deal of was exposing. So telling other people, not responding to the troll directly, but telling other people in the group, hey, this is a troll, don't respond to them. Trying to sort of manage damage control, if you like. The next one, which was quite interesting, and interesting for its difference between the groups, was this challenging strategy. And I found this more in the equestrian group with the middle-class, middle-aged women. And they would sort of recognise that someone was trolling and they would fight back, and they would usually use kind of moral arguments. What's wrong with you? Why are you doing this? Why do you behave in this way? Sort of psychologically analysing and testing this person. And the interesting difference, that was really much an RE strategy, a rec equestrian strategy. In SF, what we had was the critique or mock strategy, and this was really interesting. So bearing in mind this is young British males who are working class, and they would say things like, my granny troll's better than this, is that the best you can do? If you really want to troll effectively, you need to do these different things, you need to go for this, look, this is how I do this. So it was really very much a critiquing, challenging, oh, you're really funny, you can hang around for a while type thing. So a really interesting difference in the way those two particular groups responded to trolling. And the final strategy that I found, or the final response type, was literally reciprocating, trolling the troll. Some individuals would literally go and find that person, track them around the internet, and start attacking them on their sites as well. So in final, there's much more to be done on this question yet. That's very early results from that one. The final sort of area that I would go on to, a bit of a depressing final note, is trolling the only kind of online abuse to worry about? The answer to that, unsurprisingly, is no. Trolling is one type of negatively marked online behaviour. There's lots of other kinds, and some of them sort of blur over. So on the slide that will pop up in a moment, you'll see that there are other behaviours like, for instance, cyberbullying, which is often used as a synonym interchangeably with trolling, and yet has some key differences. There's behaviours like cyberstalking, for instance, online predation, catfishing, and so forth. So trolling is one behaviour, and it's interesting for all of its own reasons, but it's certainly not the only kind of online misbehaviour that we need to be looking at. Thank you very much.